The E3-1241V3, or the i7-4770 equivalent Xeon, as I like calling it, is a special CPU for me, since I used it for almost a decade. And while I did switch to a different platform earlier this year, I still wanted to find out how well the Haswell i7 holds up today. The CPU was launched 11 years ago, and I got one of them in the next hardware swap at our company shortly after that. The hyper-threaded quad-core boosting to 3.9 GHz was quite appreciated back then. And while the TDP listed is 80 watts, MSI Afterburner does not report more than 50 watts used by the CPU while gaming. This then makes the aluminum flower type of a cooler quite adequate. The Z230 workstation that it comes in uses 32 GB of DDR3 running at 1600 MHz in dual channel. The 420 watts PSU that it comes with has a 6-pin power connector. And while I did use a more powerful PSU in the past, I decided to keep this one that the PC came with and use the RX 570 as the GPU of choice. Just like with the other CPUs tested in the past, I used the GigASUS rendering test to get a feel on the CPU's IPC. Both hyperthreading and the larger L3 cache should help it perform better than the i5 reviewed in the past, and towards the end of the video we'll find out by how much. And since this is a CPU review, all games used for testing were run at the lowest resolution and lowest settings available. In the case of Marvel Rivals, this meant 720 resolution and 30% render scale. Now, I do not advise anyone play the game like this. Again, this is more for academic purposes to find the limits of the CPU. And in this case, this means 135 FPS for the average and 85 FPS for the 1% lows. This means that with a better graphics card, this CPU can still play this. For Cyberpunk 2077, however, I went for an even lower pixel count at 1024 by 768. I set all options to their minimum and the built-in benchmark averaged 84 FPS while reaching almost 60 FPS for the 1% lows. Now, two notes about those options set to minimum. The game will still be GPU limited with the RX 570, and some of those options, controlling NPC, crowd density and variety, do affect the CPU itself. I remember the finals having the 1% lows in the 30s last time I played it on the Haswell CPU. But this time around, at 720 resolution and 50% render scale, the CPU not only got 108 FPS for the average, but also almost 60 FPS for the 1% lows. With a better GPU, the Xeon can still play this one. Pretty much the same can be said about Robocop. As mentioned in previous videos, the bar for single player is 30 FPS for the 1% lows, and the hyper-threaded Haswell quad-core manages to clear it and more. At 720 resolution, 50% render scale and low settings, the CPU is good for 58 FPS for the average and 47 for the 1% lows. More than enough for this title. Fortnite was the first game I started testing the CPU with, and I noticed something odd. If the GPU usage is too low, its frequency will drop from the expected 1244 MHz to 800, with disastrous results for the 1% lows, as seen here for the 720 resolution results, 151 FPS for the average and 16 FPS for the 1% lows. The cure for this is a bit counterintuitive, especially since we want to test the CPU. Increase the GPU load by increasing the resolution to 1600 by 900. The video card now no longer drops its core frequency, and you can tell this not just by the average being better at 156, but more so by the 1% lows, now in the mid-90s. Unlike Fortnite running on Unreal Engine 5, Terminator runs on Unreal Engine 4, making it easier to run. At 720 resolution and 50% resolution scale, the average FPS of close to 180 would have you think that this is the case. But then the 1% loads in the mid-80s will bring the expectations of a smooth gameplay back to life, back to reality. While still being well above the 30 FPS bar I have for single-player titles, it is still less than 50% of the average FPS. Still, the CPU is quite able to play the game, and the smoothness of the game can be easily forced with a 60 FPS frame cap done through Riva Tuner statistics. This is not the first time testing Counter-Strike 2 on the CPU, and even this is a serious understatement. 720 resolution and low settings has our usual bot matching DE dust averaging 113 FPS and reaching high 60s for the 1% lows. In my case, it would not be the CPU preventing me from enjoying this game. Far Cry 6 is GPU heavy enough so that low settings 720 resolution and 50% render scale would not trigger the changes in GPU frequency seen initially with Fortnite. This also means, however, that the test is not fully CPU bound. But even so, 86 FPS for the average and 66 for the 1% lows means that the game is playable on the 4th gen i7 chips. Just like Counter-Strike 2, Apex Legends was tested quite frequently with the CPU. But this was the first time I got to see how switching to DirectX 12 only affected the performance of the CPU, so I fired up the game at 720 resolution and low settings. The Haswell managed close to 200 FPS for the average and 111 for the 1% lows. Now, I would have loved to get that last metric higher, but the test was not fully CPU bound and the 0.1% loss was also in the low 90s, so overall the experience was good. Doom Eternal is easy on the CPU, much to nobody's surprise. I used the first fight scene as a benchmark, and at 720 resolution and 50% render scale, the CPU performed very well with an average FPS above 200 and the 1% lows close to 150. Even the 0.1% lows were above 100, so with a good enough GPU, you can enjoy this game at less eye strain inducing settings. In a similar vein as Apex Legends, Rainbow Six Siege went DirectX 12 only, and just like Apex Legends, the game remained playable with a 4th Gen i7, as seen from the test results of close to 200 FPS for the average and above 100 FPS for the 1% lows. The test was carried out at low settings, 720 resolution and 50% render scale, to try to shift the bottleneck to the CPU as much as possible. Control, however, still allows DirectX 11 as a rendering API, if you specify the -DX11 option as launch parameter. There was little difference in performance between DirectX 12 and DirectX 11 APIs, and at 960 by 540 low settings, the CPU averaged around 150 FPS in both cases, with 1% lows between high 70s and low 80s. This is quite fine for this game. The results for Overwatch 2, however, had no reason to change, but they are more relevant for the GPU. This is one of the games that have close to no CPU usage, and at 720 resolution and low settings, my test run got an average of 454 FPS with 1% lows above 300. Dropping the resolution to the MS-DOS appropriate 640 by 480 was not quite enough to get Resident Evil 4 to be CPU bound, and this is despite using the prioritized performance preset. Still, for a game where the bar is set to 30 FPS for the 1% lows, you'll be happy to hear that the 4th Gen i7 can deliver more than that. My test run had an average of 105 FPS, with the 1% lows at 62. Nothing changed for DOTA 2. Same rendering API, same CPU limited behavior at 1080 resolution and low settings. This also means the same average in the 80s and 1% lows in the high 40s, so let's just move on to the next one. Being a single-player title, Shadow of the Tomb Raider enjoys the same low bar as Resident Evil 4, of at least 30 FPS for the 1% lows. I tested using the built-in benchmark at 800 by 600 and low settings. Again, the choice of settings was to ensure a CPU bottleneck. And I got 118 FPS for the average and 68 for the 1% lows. Plenty for this title. I decided to test Borderlands 3 at 720 resolution, very low settings, but 100% render scale. Just like with Fortnite, reducing the GPU load too much would have its core frequency oscillate between the expected 1244 MHz and 800. So, not 100% CPU limited, but even so, the benchmark averaged 68 FPS and got the 1% lows at 49. The game will run okay on the CPU. When it comes to estimating IPC improvements, I use a video compression workload, the last rendering stage for the video review of the GigASUS R9270. In the case of the Xeon E3-1241v3, the work was finished in 22 minutes and 46 seconds. We then used the same methodology of multiplying with the number of cores and the average frequency across all cores, and we get 19,817 billion clock cycles. This then placed the hyper-threaded Haswell quad-core between its non-hyper-threaded relative and the Zen Plus Ryzen 5 2600, with the AMD part doing better. This is an important detail and we'll come around to it in the conclusions. When building the AM4 based PC, I didn't quite realize that this also meant retirement for my trusty Z230. Firing up the workstation again felt good, as the familiarity of the desktop settled in, but also sad, as I realized that it'll get as much usage as the 2nd gen Intel CPUs, barely any. And funny enough, this is not because the CPU is too weak. Okay, it's far from being a spring chicken, but it can still play the easier to run online titles and quite a bunch of the older AAAs. It's just that it happens that I have better platforms available. So, that being the case, what would be a fair price for one? With 2nd gen i5s going as low as less than 10 USD, you would expect the Haswell based i7s to not go above 20. But plenty do. And with the same Zen Plus chips I mentioned earlier at the very same price level, I would not recommend buying the older Intel CPU. You would already be maxed out on the LGA 1150 platform. Meanwhile, AM4 would allow you to even consider X3D chips as possible upgrades. Pity, a chip that is still usable but available at dumb price points. Not the conclusion I expected for this video, but nevertheless a conclusion. Thanks for watching, I hope you liked it, and